Bob Mueller putting another former Trump aide behind bars. Today, the man who kicked off this whole Russia probe, you've heard his name, George Papadopoulos, reporting to federal prison in Wisconsin. Now, he'll serve a light 2 weeks for lying to the feds, part of his reward, really, for cooperating with Mueller. The move comes as Donald Trump has installed a loyalist as the acting attorney general, which has many legal experts wondering if a collision between Mueller and his new boss is inevitable, just a matter of time. Now, Mueller has kept the heat on, a judge denying a Papadopoulos request to delay what you see here, which is him getting ready for the sentence. The aide, of course, has also gone public complaining of misconduct, which contradicts his own wife, who had also spoken to the FBI in this probe and told me the Mueller investigation was never unfair.
I believe there was tremendous misconduct on the government's behalf regarding my case.
There have been allegations that it's a quote-unquote witch hunt. You didn't find that in your...
I never found that. They just wanted me to clarify a certain number of things, and I never felt that they were making a false allegation or they were doing an unfair job. Never.
Never found them to be doing an unfair job. So obviously there's some splintering there as Papadopoulos goes into jail. But this reward for cooperation does come as other witnesses tangle with Mueller and consider their own fate. Also news tonight, Roger Stone associate and conspiracy theorist Jerome Corsi telling our own NBC News that Mueller's team offered him a plea deal for perjury regarding what he said about contact with Julian Assange. That's a Papadopoulos-style offer when you think about it. And he says he's not buying.
From what they've offered, I can tell you it's unacceptable. I will not sign a statement in front of a federal judge that says I intentionally and willfully lied to the special counselor, because I did not.
Today is also the deadline for Mueller's team to submit an update on Paul Manafort's cooperation since he pleaded guilty, and that's just what's public. We also know Mueller has other angles, including this New York Times bombshell report that Trump tried to order a DOJ investigation of another key witness, James Comey, as well as his rival Hillary Clinton. I have a special report with my take on that later tonight. All of this is adding up to a situation where even some of Trump's biggest defenders are warning of big trouble.
We're getting information from Paul Manafort. We're getting information perhaps from Corsi. We're already getting information from Gates, from Cohen, from Flynn. That's an awful lot of people tied to the president providing evidence.
It is, and I think the report is going to be devastating to the president. And I know that the president's team is already working on a response to the report.
Devastating. In a moment, I'll speak to Congressman Eric Swalwell on the Intelligence Committee, as well as Jason Johnson of The Root. That is our Washington conversation. But we begin right here on set with Maya Wiley, former counsel to the mayor of New York City and a civil prosecutor from the Southern District of New York, and Mara Gay, an editorial board member of the New York Times. Thanks to both of you for being here. Maya, Jerome Corsi does seem to be publicly staking out a very different position from other people who've been hit with these claims. What do you think he's doing?
Well, first, let's start with the fact that he entered into plea agreement discussions in the first place. So to sort of say today, wait, they wanted me to say that I had lied is a little bit disingenuous, because they had to have been discussing that from the beginning of the plea deal discussions, or else why are you having a plea deal discussion?
And perjury would be one of the lighter items on that menu.
Absolutely. So, I think it's very interesting that he's taken this route. Obviously, without being an attorney that has had conversations with him or knows more about what the Mueller team has, it's hard to assess it. But I did find it surprising, given that he had entered into the plea negotiations in the first place. Normally, you don't do that unless you're really planning to make a deal. The other possibility is he didn't have enough to offer, right? Mueller is not going to be the person publicly commenting on their discussions about a plea deal. It's also possible that he wasn't able to offer enough to make it worth their while. We don't know.
Well, and 2 weeks isn't bad for this kind of thing. So Jerome Corsi looking at something that's similar to Papadopoulos, we can reasonably ascertain that it's not like Mueller would be looking at a max or a year for him. It would be something manageable.
Well, and remember that really what Mueller was looking for Papadopoulos was up to 6 months. And Papadopoulos got only 14 days, which may have sent a signal as well to Corsi that this might not be so bad, even though you technically face up to 5 years. Maybe he thought, maybe he's thinking pardon, maybe he's thinking, I might beat this in any way, it might not be so bad. We don't know. The interesting thing about Papadopoulos is, remember, this is a man who pled guilty. he pled guilty. He said, I did it. I lied.
Yeah.
And now he's sort of saying, going to court and sort of saying, this is all.
He's all over the place.
He's all over the place.
You mentioned whether, of course, he's more likely to get a pardon. And while Donald Trump isn't known for his reading list, I think that's an accurate statement. He is in the racist birther Book of the Month Club with Jerome Corsi. I mean, they are together on that. Take a listen to Corsi teeing up a defense that's sort of similar to what Roger Stone and others have said, which is, it may have looked like I knew what was coming, but really I'm just really good at figuring things out and making predictions.
What the special counselor couldn't figure out was that in August, I knew that, in fact, the emails remaining that Julian Assange had were Podesta's emails. And I basically figured it out, which is what I do. I connect the dots. I didn't need any source to tell me.
That's what he does. He just connects the dots.
It's really spectacular. Yet again, this is straight out of the Donald Trump, but also Rudy Giuliani playbook of, I'm going to fight one battle in court, and then I'm going to fight another battle entirely in the court of public opinion. And it's kind of whiplash-inducing because, of course, you have people like Papadopoulos, of course, as you pointed out, Maya, saying, no, I did it, I'm guilty. And then the next minute, they're on national television somewhere saying, oh, it was really no big deal. So I think ultimately, Bob Mueller hopefully is going to have the final word here, and the courts will have the final word, justice. I do think, though, that this is interesting because we've moved away at this point from conversations about the election, and now the focus is right back where it was before on this Mueller investigation.
Right.
And I think the walls might be closing in a little bit here because the Congress is now no longer solely in Republican hands.
But I wonder if part of what you're saying makes them look bad as incompetent also provides a decent defense for some of these people. Because I was down in Florida, it's on my mind. I call it the Broward County defense, which is can't be much of a conspiracy if they can't put together like lunch. Like if they have trouble conspiring to serve lunch at the elections office, there's not like a statewide voter fraud conspiracy. And likewise, Jerome Corsi, George Papadopoulos, who was in the center of this in the beginning with the email tip in Europe, and Roger Stone, who of course seems a little more competent, none of these people look like they could pull off a secret international collusion conspiracy right now.
And yet, I mean, Maya might have more perspective on this. I don't know that would pass the sniff test in a court. I think the question is whether they actually committed a crime, and if that can be proven, then...
Yeah, if they intended to get information that was stolen by Russian nationals in order to help Donald Trump win, it doesn't matter that they did it incompetently if they tried to do it. It doesn't even matter if they didn't know all aspects of what Robert Mueller might call a conspiracy in this case, right? You don't have to know about every aspect of the conspiracy if you know one aspect of it, one part of it, in order to be guilty.
Well, that's why they call you, in the Kremlin, they would call you a useful idiot.
Yeah.
I think that is the term.
You know, the other thing that I find so striking about this, particularly when you quote Alan Dershowitz talking about the way that this Mueller report is going to be so devastating for Donald Trump, all of these folks, I mean, from Papadopoulos to Corsi to Roger Stone to Trump himself, have actually done a really good job creating what should have been politically devastating. Right, including Donald Trump himself making statements like, oh, yeah, I actually got rid of Comey because I was thinking about the Robert Mueller investigation. So when you put it all together, what he's really saying is it going to be embarrassing enough for Republicans to actually say the word impeachment?
And you couldn't help but notice Alan Dershowitz made a political statement, not a legal one. He said it'll politically look bad, but actually won't legally be a crime, which is a very smart way, if you are an advocate, of acting like you're conceding something while still defending Donald Trump. And Alan Dershowitz, if we take him at his word, doesn't know all the evidence because he's not privately a lawyer for the president, so he doesn't know yet. Although we look forward to having him back on the program to hear what he knows. Maya, Mara, thanks to both of you. I want to turn now to the congressman. There's reporting the White House might be caught flat-footed by the onslaught investigations from the House, Democrats taking over. White House counsel Don McGahn, of course, already out from October, and his replacement, Pat Cipollone, is going through a background check and is held up. Politico saying the office down to a skeletal staff and not prepared to deal with a flood of potential subpoenas from, well, people like this. California Congressman Eric Swalwell, who serves on both the Intelligence and Judiciary Committees, and here for a Washington perspective, Jason Johnson from The Root, also with us. Congressman, what do you think of that storyline, and will it be a defense for the White House to say, we're not staffed up, so we need more time to respond to you and the chairs you'll be working with?
Good evening, Ari. I think it also reflects a White House that has become all too comfortable with the Republican Congress that has just given them free passes in this ollie oxen free environment for the last 2 years, where they can get away with whatever they want and not be held to account. Well, that is going to change in about 39 days when the new Congress comes in. And what we are going to do is we're going to fill in the gaps on the Russia investigation. We're going to seek to protect Bob Mueller, and we're going to understand why the president continues to have these transactional relationships that put his transactions above our country's values. That happened with Russia. That's why this is so important. It's more important than the characters of Jerome Corsi or Roger Stone. It's about the rule of law and the president putting transactional relationships above that. And it's also playing out right now in real time with Jamal Khashoggi's death, where a U.S. resident working for a U.S. publication was killed on the soil of a NATO ally. And we are almost acting as accessories after the fact to help the Saudis cover it up because of the president's transactional relationship. So those days are over, and he can expect much more accountability.
Jason, I see you nodding. Do you have a thought, and do you have a question for the congressman?
Yes. So the key thing here is, where do we start, right? I mean, the levels of not just conspiratorial, but absolute corruption and incompetence in this administration are so many that many people wonder, okay, we're really thrilled if there was a blue wave that came in. What will the new leadership focus on? Will it immediately go after Trump's finances? Will there be requests for tax returns? That's the real question that the American citizens are concerned about. And I'm wondering where the congressman thinks that the new Democrats will go first.
And Jason raises a great point. There's almost so much out there that you have to really prioritize it, because in any other administration, you would think that Jared Kushner failing to fill out a security clearance a dozen times and not disclosing his own interest is the biggest issue. That would be the case in most administrations. Here we have the president's dealings with Russia, the dealings with Saudi Arabia, cashing in on access to the Oval Office by easing sanctions with the Chinese on ZTE while they're giving him $500 million on a Trump Tower property. And then, oh yeah, the emoluments clause issue. So we want to do a few things and do them right, to not overwhelm the American people, but to show them that, again, that we're going to do our job and put a balance of power on this abuse of power.
Well, and Congressman, you mentioned Kushner, and I saw you told the New York Times today that's not as high on your list. The president obviously is trying to have it both ways and say that the Democrats are going to overreach in dealing with his family. And I think for family members of the president who are uninvolved, who are truly what we might say civilians, who happen to be family members, there probably should traditionally be some deference. But do you think that it's an abuse of that spirit, of that good faith, as lawyers might say, with a president who has insisted for the first time in U.S. history on controlling and owning a business and putting his family in charge of that so that they can profit while they're in government, and then, as we all know, installing other members of his family in government who've now been flouting email rules, among other things?
Right. It's one thing, Ari, if it's just straight corruption, and that should be dealt with ideally criminally. It's another thing, though, if the president's financial interests are driving U.S. foreign policy, and that's what we're seeing with Saudi Arabia and with Russia. And I think that's what we want to really zero in on and make sure that we can intervene where we can and where we weren't able to in the last 2 years.
Right.
And Jason, before I let you go, what is the feeling in your view in Washington here as we get past the holiday, as we have the bombshell report I'm going to deal with more tonight regarding the targeting of trying to jail James Comey and Hillary Clinton, of the blue wave tonight reaching even higher numbers? Are you starting to see in your reporting and in the mood that shift in Washington, or not yet?
I think people are beginning to get a bit excited. I think one thing that's happened today is sort of the obstinacy and the arrogance of these people heading to jail, whether it's Jerome Corsi saying, I won't sign this, or Papadopoulos acting like, I mean, he's going to jail for 2 weeks. 2 weeks, and you were involved in possibly attacking American democracy. He acts like he's going to have a do-rag and singing Locked Up, okay? He's going to be in Club Fed for 2 weeks, and then he will walk out. So I think a lot of people are shocked that even as this net becomes tighter and tighter on this administration, the boldness and the arrogance of the Trump administration continues. So we'll be interested to see how the blue wave starts to rein some of these people in.
I think that certainly is one of the notes we're picking up. It's a fascinating period, and it's clearly a transition period. Jason, thanks for your reporting. Congressman, thanks for making time for us.
Thank you, Ari.
Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.